how's it going, guys? So this is Alan from Dream Big Live Tiny. I am back here at the Blue Beetle shipping container house in Marble Falls. I hope you guys enjoyed the short little tour that we did a couple days ago. I just wanted to kind of create this short little video in addition to talk a little bit about utilities for tiny houses. Now, I know this is a subject that is a bit of a gray area for a lot of different reasons, for methodology that people use for building, access that people have when they actually are looking for a place to either build or park their tiny house. And it's going to really depend a lot on where you live as well. If you're in the United States, like which city, which county, which state. So there's a lot out there, a lot of information. I just want to kind of break down the systems, the utilities that we actually see here. Specifically in this tiny house, there's a great little setup showcasing everything on the exterior that I'd love to just walk you guys through, just so you get a better idea of how things work and how you power and bring water into a tiny house. Now, before we get started and dive into the actual systems that we have here in this tiny house, I want to kind of broadly talk about utilities in relation to tiny houses. So in all homes, you're basically going to be looking at three sort of pillars that you need when you're thinking of utilities. So there's electricity, there's water, and then there's gas. And so all three of these work in conjunction to bring water into your house, to remove water from your house, to bring power into your house, to be able to power down your house in the case of an emergency, and lastly, to heat and cool your house. So water, of course, is an essential utility. You obviously need a source to bring water into the house. So typically you're going to have some sort of well or a city water outlet that you're going to connect some sort of hose to and connect that into your tiny house. It's pretty simple. The disposal of the water, however, is where things can get a little tricky depending on what systems you have in your tiny house. Do you have gray water? Do you have black water? I'm assuming that you're on a pretty normal tiny house setup. You're most likely going to have a composting toilet. And so that's going to remove the need to dispose of any black water, which is honestly a huge plus and really removes a huge headache for a lot of us, as I'll kind of get into that in a little bit later. So having a system to dispose of your gray water is also important, whether that be running that water into city sewage or having your own gray water system that you've built onto your land. Secondly, electricity is obviously essential to bring power into your house, to power your lights, to power your electronics, your appliances, things like that, all your outlets. And lastly, we have gas. Now, gas can come in one of two forms. It's either going to be natural gas from any city lines, or it could be liquid propane or LP, which you could easily purchase at your local grocery store or hardware store. And there are refill stations literally everywhere. So very easy to come by and pretty cheap when it comes to heating your house, whether that be heating the inside with a propane heater or heating your water. So in conjunction, those three things are what make up the utilities in your tiny house. Now, some tiny houses are going to utilize all three, others are only going to utilize two. It's really going to depend on you, your function of the house, your comfort level, which is probably best to go with. Personally, I use all three in my house. Obviously, I have running water coming in with a gray water system. I have electricity to power all of my outlets, all of my lights, my appliances, but I also use propane to heat water in my house. So I have a propane water heater, and that for me is a great little setup. I also use the propane to heat my stovetop, so I cook with propane. But I also have an oven that's electric. So in conjunction, I use all three simultaneously. So it's really going to depend on your specific needs which one you should go with. I would say most tiny houses opt to go with a mixture of all three. However, some people, and this is something if you're considering building or buying a tiny house, you should consider, some people like to avoid using gas at all costs. And so obviously they'll have normal water coming in and water coming out, but they'll basically use electricity to power and heat their home entirely. So they'll have an electric water heater, and they'll also have some sort of electric AC unit that also does heat, like a mini split system that has a heat pump. So in that case, opting out of using propane is usually a little bit more user-friendly or comfortable. You don't really have to mess with propane tanks or anything like that. But to be honest, once you learn how to do it, it's not that big of a headache and can save you quite a bit of money on your heating bill. So now that we got that little rundown, let's dive into the system that we have here at the Blue Beetle. Okay, so on this side of the home, what you see here is the actual setup of all the utilities on the exterior, which is quite rare in a tiny house. You typically see a mixture of, you know, you'll sometimes see the hot water heater outside, but typically you'll see the box, and a lot of these lines will actually be built into the wall. Again, if you choose materials that can withstand weather, it's totally fine. But I think in this case, this is actually a perfect setup to kind of show you guys, you know, the inputs of where this stuff is coming in and how it all kind of works together to power, heat, and cool your house. So to start off, we're going to talk about electricity for a second. So electricity is going to be coming in through that little box that you see over there. And so that box is connected to city utility, city electricity. And there's actually a 50 amp plug. There's two plugs actually. There's two 50 amp plugs, but one of them is connected, and there is a power cord running along here. You see this black cord coming here. And then it's connected, this 50 amp is connected to this adapter right here. And so this runs up the conduit up into the box. And so I'm gonna open up this box, show you guys inside of here. So this is like a typical, I believe it's a 250 amp box because I see the service disconnect up there. There's two 125 amp breakers. But everything else consists of, it looks like 20 amp and 15 amp breakers. You could see all the things that they correspond to: the left side outlets, right side outlets, washer dryer outlet, living room lights, kitchen lights, bathroom lights. And then of course there's two dedicated breakers for the mini split. So definitely a lot more than you would need in a tiny house, primarily because tiny houses either come in 50 amp or 30 amp with 30 amp plugs. So, you know, even a 30 amp should be more than enough for a typical tiny house. However, once you have a washer dryer and a mini split in the same house, you really want to consider going up to a 50 amp. A 50 amp plug bringing 50 amps of power into the house, because essentially every single appliance that could potentially be running should be able to run comfortably all at the same time without a fear of overriding those 30 amps or, you know, basically switching off the breakers. So we have electricity coming in, the city electricity coming into the breaker, and then we have essentially the conduit going into the house, and that will split everything. We'll go to all the outlets, all the lights, and then we have electricity. The same system, electricity, you know, still talking about electricity, we have a mini split system here on the exterior. So the mini split system provides heating and cooling to the house via electricity. We have this power line running here, again, into the breaker box. So we have power for the mini split system, heating and cooling. So there's also a power cord that runs from the breaker box to this propane water heater. So we'll move directly into propane. So here we have a Rheem tankless water heater. It is a propane water heater. So essentially what we have here is this liquid propane tank. Again, I said you could buy anywhere, you know, basically grocery stores, hardware stores, whatever. They're super cheap to buy and to refill. So we have this connected to a regulator, the propane line running up and coming into the hot water heater. So this tankless water heater essentially heats water on demand. So you're not going to have this huge tank water heater that you will typically see in a normal sized house, because they have space for it. In this case, we don't have space for it. So this tankless water heater, what it does is it actually brings up water through this line, and I'll show you guys the water source in a second. So this cold water will come into the tankless water heater up here, and then there's, you know, obviously a bunch of coils in there. With the propane lit, it starts heating the water as it goes into the tank or I should say as it goes into the water heater, and then as it comes out, you have that hot water line going into the house, which will, you know, provide hot water for the shower, provide hot water for the faucet in the bathroom, and provide hot water for the sink in the kitchen. And then lastly, with propane, we have this additional kind of like this T connection here where this propane is going up into the tank, but there's also a line that curls and goes into here. And so this additional propane line actually goes to the propane stovetop. So again, you're cooking with propane as well. Then lastly, and this is obviously going to be an essential thing for any house, we have the water line. So again, right there, the same post where we have the electricity, there's also a water faucet. So this water is coming from the ground, probably from the city utilities as well. So they probably called someone to get that installed, and there's actually 2 water faucets. So they could probably hook up a second tiny house because there's a second electrical 50 amp outlet and also a second water spigot. So you take your hose. It can be a traditional garden hose or a contractor hose, as long as it reaches, obviously. So that blue hose is coming in here, and then it's going into this RV water filter right here. So that's the first filter. It's coming up here, and then there's a second water filter here. I mean, I guess you could never have too many water filters. And then we have the PEX lines running. We have cold water going to the faucets. And then we have, again, this cold water going into the hot water heater, which kind of begins that whole system where the cold water turns into hot water. But in this case, this line that shoots this way prior to entering, or that I should say that never actually enters the water heater. So this cold water is essentially the cold water that you're going to have everywhere in the house. So cold water in the shower, cold water in the bathroom sink, and cold water in the kitchen sink. So that is pretty much it, guys. It is a very simple yet very efficient system that works cohesively with electricity, water, and propane. So I hope you guys enjoyed that little breakdown of the utilities here at the Blue Beetle shipping container house. So that system is very, very similar to what I have in my tiny house. So similarly, my system also has electricity, water, and propane working cohesively to bring power, bring water, and bring heat into my house. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little rundown of the utilities. If you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, or any comments whatsoever. So I'm not an expert in any of these things. I've never built these systems, but I know how they work because I've had to basically provide maintenance to them over the course of the last 1.5 years, and I've done tons of research before actually purchasing my tiny house, so that I knew what I needed and I knew what I was getting myself into prior to even thinking about the whole process. So this is definitely something that you want to put some attention into when you're considering building or buying a tiny house. It's not going to make or break the decision by any means, but it could definitely affect where you can ultimately park or build your tiny house. And again, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is going to come down to 2 things. One, your needs. So that'll determine what kind of system you need. And then secondly, where you live. So city, county, state regulations are all going to come into play as to what you can actually put on your property. So other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.